The asteroid slowly spun through space, a dead piece of iron and stone tumbling through the dark between stars. Lights flickered on its scarred surface, harsh industrial beams cutting through clouds of dust kicked up by endless drilling. The noise never stopped. Machines grinding, pickaxes cracking against rock, and pressurized airlocks opening and closing with a hiss like the breath of a huge, dying creature. Think of your prison as a whole planet, not just four walls. A tomb that is silent and unforgiving, moving through the void at thousands of miles per hour, so far from any inhabited world that light takes years to reach you. Cale Vinson's life was like this now. Cale stood in the processing bay, his prison-issue suit covered in gray dust that never really went away. There were patches on the suit in a dozen places, and the seals were barely holding up against the vacuum outside. He had the haunted look of men twice his age at 32, sunken eyes, gaunt cheeks, and hands that shook slightly even when he was still. But his eyes said something else. They were sharp, always moving and keeping track of everything around them. Cale was a systems engineer on Mars Colony 7 6 months ago. He designed atmospheric processors that kept 20,000 people alive. He had been a good worker. Careful, creative, and thorough. Maybe too creative. Someone had to be blamed when the colony's main life support system broke down in a big way, killing 47 people. The investigation went quickly, and the trial went even faster. Negligent homicide through willful system modification, the judge had said, her voice echoing in the courtroom. Cale Vinson, you are now sentenced to 20 years of hard labor at Facility Sigma 9. Cale had tried to make things clear. The changes he made were better, and they should have stopped the failure that happened from happening. But someone had messed with his code, sabotaged his work, and turned his safety measures into huge holes. He had the proof, or at least he thought he did, until it mysteriously vanished from the court records. His public defender, who was tired and had too many cases, had just shrugged. Mr. Vinson, juries don't like corporate conspiracy theories. Especially since the company in question hires half of the colony, for 20 years. On a mine on an asteroid. It was like a death sentence. Facility Sigma 9 wasn't made to help people get better. It was built to get valuable minerals out of the asteroid and every ounce of usefulness out of the people who were sent there. The asteroid, catalog number 2174 Omega, was full of platinum, rhodium, and rare earth elements that were worth billions. The prisoners were cheap workers who could be replaced. There were 237 people living in the building, but that number changed. There were a lot of accidents in mining. Exposure to radiation, broken equipment, and just plain tiredness all had an effect. A prisoner at Sigma 9 could expect to live for 7 years on average. Not many of them finished their sentences. Cale's first month was all about staying alive. The work was hard. You worked 12-hour shifts in the deep mines, where you chipped away at solid rock in almost complete darkness. The only light you had was a flickering lamp on your helmet. The asteroid's low gravity, which was only 2% of Earth's, made every movement feel light and unsteady. You had to learn to work slowly and trust your magnetic boots to keep you steady. There weren't many guards, but their automated systems made sure they were always there. Drones flew around the tunnels, keeping an eye on each prisoner's location, vital signs, and work output. You'd feel the sting of a shock baton if you stepped out of line, or worse, you'd be locked up in isolation. A tiny cell with just enough oxygen to keep you alive, left alone with your thoughts and the endless silence. Cale had seen men fall apart. He had seen Jake Morrison, a former pilot who was found guilty of smuggling, just stop working one day. His eyes were blank, and he was mumbling to himself about the stars he would never see again. The guards had pulled him away. After that, no one saw Jake. But Cale would not give in. Maybe it was because he was stubborn, or maybe it was because he was angry every time he thought about the real criminals who were free while he rotted here. No matter what it was, it kept him going through those first awful weeks. Then, on the 43rd day of his sentence, something happened. Cale was working in Tunnel 7 Beta, a deep hole that went down to the center of the asteroid. The tunnel was old. It was one of the first ones dug when the mine opened 15 years ago. A lot of the original equipment had been left here, but newer models had taken its place and never been taken away. It cost less to let the old machines rust than to bring them back to the surface. His pickaxe hit something metal. Cale stopped to wipe away the dust. It was part of an old drilling rig, a huge piece of machinery that had been partially buried when the ceiling of the tunnel fell in years ago. Most of it was broken and useless. But one part caught his eye, a thermal exchange unit that was made to get rid of the heat that the drill made. Of course, it was broken. There was a crack in the main housing. But the main part of the mechanism was still there. Cale couldn't help but stare at it. His engineer's mind was automatically breaking down its design and noticing how simple and elegant its heat transfer system was. He then thought, This can be fixed. It was a small thought, not very important. Why would he fix a broken heat exchanger in a tunnel that no one uses? It didn't do anything. But Cale couldn't let it go. That night, in his cell, which was a small cube that was barely big enough for him to lie down in, he thought about the exchanger and mentally took it apart, figuring out what parts he would need to fix it. The next day he snuck a small tool out of the work site by hiding it in his boot. It was just a torque wrench that someone had dropped. He picked up more small things over the next week, like a spool of wire, a broken circuit board, and a few bolts. The guard's monitoring systems kept an eye on big things like power tools, cutting tools, and anything else that could be used as a weapon. But what about little parts, broken pieces, and scrap metal? People didn't pay attention to those. Every day the asteroid made a lot of trash. Who would care about some broken parts? Cale started to spend his breaks in Tunnel 7 Beta. He was just following the rules and taking his breaks in a designated area. He was working on the heat exchanger, but not officially. It happened in 3 weeks. 3 weeks of careful, patient work done in stolen moments, always aware of the patrol drone's schedules and always ready to hide his progress if a guard showed up. He had to make some parts from scratch by bending wire into certain shapes and using a rock as an anvil. And then one day it was finished. Cale hooked the exchanger up to a power line that was still live in the tunnel and held his breath as he turned it on. The unit came to life with a hum. Its lights blinked on and off before turning a steady green. It was working perfectly. Cale sat back and felt something strange wash over him. Yes, it was satisfaction, but it was also something else. He had made something for the first time since he got to this terrible place. Instead of just breaking rocks, he had fixed something that was broken. He looked at the working heat exchanger for a while, and then his eyes moved to the other pieces of equipment that had been left behind in the tunnel. There was a lot here. Drilling rigs or processors, transport sleds, and power generators are all broken and forgotten, but they could all be fixed. They could also be used for something else if they could be fixed. The idea hit him like a punch in the gut. Cale stood up quickly, his head spinning. He looked around the tunnel again and saw parts instead of junk and trash. Materials that aren't finished. What could happen? What if the things that keep you down could also set you free? It was crazy. Not possible. The kind of desperate fantasy that broken men had before they gave up completely. Cale couldn't ignore it though. His mind was already racing, figuring things out and coming up with new ideas. That he thought about the ships that came to Sigma 9 every 6 months to bring supplies. They were small, automated cargo ships with engines that could escape the asteroid's weak gravity and get to the nearest station. What were those engines really? Just controlled explosions, thrust that was contained, and navigation systems. Could mining equipment be used to make those systems? From ore processors, drilling rigs, and power plants? In theory, the answer was yes. It would take a lot of creativity, perfect execution, and materials that weren't officially available. But it was doable. Cale looked down at his hands, which were rough and scarred from months of hard work. These hands used to make systems that saved thousands of lives. Could they now come up with a way to save just one life? His own. A drone flew around the corner and scanned the tunnel. Cale sat down right away, slumping over like a tired prisoner on a break. The drone stopped for a moment to focus on him, then moved on. Cale smiled a little when it was gone. He hadn't smiled in 6 months, so this was the first time. Cale started to plan that night while lying in his cell and listening to 200 other prisoners groan and snore. Not just to dream but also to make plans. He mentally listed everything he had seen in the mines, including every piece of equipment, power source, and structural element that he would need something to push him. Support for life. Finding your way. Integrity of the hull. A power source that can run for a long time. Systems for control. And he would have to build it all in secret, right under the noses of guards and surveillance systems that were meant to stop this kind of escape. There was no way. Not even close. But what if those rocks were the key to your escape, turning from a prison into the parts of a spaceship that couldn't exist? Cale closed his eyes, and for the first time since he was sentenced, he felt something other than hopelessness. He felt like he had a reason to live. He would start tomorrow. Not with big gestures or obvious building, but with small steps. Getting things together. Learning the guard patterns to the second. Finding out which prisoners could be trusted, which ones were snitches, and which ones were just too broken to see anything. The cosmic jail cell that was supposed to be his grave would turn into his workshop. Every lost bolt and circuit would be a piece of a puzzle that couldn't be solved. They had sent him to an asteroid mine, where they thought he would dig until he died. Cale Vinson would have to dig his way to freedom instead. The asteroid kept rolling through the emptiness, not caring that one of its prisoners had just sparked a defiant fire. But that spark would get bigger. It would turn into a flame and then into a firestorm. and in the end the roar of engines would break the silence of the tomb forever. The change didn't happen all at once. Cale knew that if he rushed, he would die or worse, be sent to solitary confinement where he wouldn't be able to get the tools and materials he needed. He moved slowly and carefully, like a chess player who was planning 10 moves ahead. Knowledge was his top priority. Cale started to really look into Facility Sigma 9, not as a prisoner serving time, but as an engineer looking at a system. Every system had flaws, things that didn't work well and things that weren't clear. He only needed to find them. The rotation of guards was on a strict schedule. The shift changed every 4 hours. There was a 12-minute window during the changeover when the new guards were getting briefings and the old guards were signing out. During those 12 minutes, the surveillance drones flew on their own, following set patrol routes without any human supervision. 12 minutes. Not a lot, but enough. Cale also found out that the mine's inventory system was very messy. At the start of each shift, tools were checked out and then checked back in at the end. However, they were tracked by weight and general category, not by serial number. The system thought that a drill bit and a circuit board were the same if they weighed about the same. He learned about the mine's power grid, including which conduits carried what voltage, where the backup generators were, and which tunnels had extra power supplies that wouldn't be missed if they were tapped. He knew by heart where all the cameras, sensors, and weak spots in the facility's security system were. And he started to gather. Collecting was a form of art. Cale never took anything obvious or whole parts. Instead, he picked up things that were ignored or thrown away. A solar panel that was broken and thrown away still worked at 60% of its full capacity. A servo motor from a mining drone that crashed. The casing was broken, but the internal parts were fine. Wiring taken off of equipment that is no longer in use. There were dozens of bolts, screws, and other fasteners that had built up one or two at a time. He made places to hide all over the mine. In Tunnel 7 Beta, he dug out a small hole behind a broken support beam and carefully covered it up so no one could see it. He found a ventilation shaft in the processing bay that had been sealed off years ago but was still open at one end. He found a conveyor belt in the waste reclamation area that broke down all the time, making the security cameras blind for exactly 45 seconds every few hours. There was a different type of material in each hiding place. All the electronics in one place. Parts of the structure in another. Tools and machines for making things in a third. He made sure that he wouldn't lose everything by spreading out his cash. But just having materials wasn't enough. Cale needed a place to work, which was much harder to hide. The asteroid itself gave the answer in an unexpected way. Cale was put on a geological survey team during his 4th month at Sigma 9. The mine operators would send crews to map new parts of the asteroid every so often to look for rich veins of valuable minerals. It was a prestigious job because it meant less physical work and more technical work. The operators didn't know that it let Cale into parts of the asteroid that hadn't been fully explored yet. Cale found a natural cavity in a remote area, far from the main mining operations. This void in the asteroid was made millions of years ago when it was formed. The hole was about 20 feet wide and shaped like a sphere. The only way to get in was through a narrow crack that people had to squeeze through in a line. The survey team marked it as geologically insignificant on their maps and moved on. But Cale saw right away what it could do. It was perfect, secluded, hidden, and big enough to work in. He purposely miscalibrated the survey equipment when scanning that area, which caused mistakes in the mapping data that made the cavity look smaller and harder to get to than it really was. The cavity was marked as investigated, no mineral value, when the survey report was filed, and it was forgotten. That hole in the ground became his shipyard. It was very hard to get the equipment there. Cale couldn't just walk across the surface of the asteroid with parts because the outside cameras would see him right away. Instead, he used the mine's own tunnel system, carefully extending a service tunnel that officially ended 50 feet before the hole. He worked alone in that tunnel during his shifts, chipping away at the rock to make a hidden passage. It took 7 weeks to get through. 7 weeks of hard work done in stolen moments, always listening for footsteps and ready to hide his progress behind carefully placed rock panels that looked like a natural wall. Cale felt like an explorer finding a new world when he finally broke through into the cavity. He stood in the dark with only the light from his helmet lamp, and slowly turned in a circle, mentally dividing the area into sections. Area for making things. Place to put things together. Storage for parts. Zone for testing. He started moving things over one small piece at a time. He would take a few things during each shift and carefully hide them in his clothes or tool bag. It took a long time, but it was safe. Then he started to build. The first part was a power system. Nothing else mattered without power. Kale took 3 broken solar panels from the trash area and spent weeks fixing them up in his secret spot. He also used parts from an old life support heater to make a thermal generator that worked. The inside of the asteroid was cold, but mining operations made heat differences that could be used. He could use tools once he had power. He made a simple welding torch out of parts from a plasma cutter and powered it with his homemade generator. He made a workbench out of parts from a broken or conveyor. He made a simple computer terminal out of broken circuit boards and a broken display screen. He then programmed it with software he wrote from memory. Kale would tell his cellmate, a quiet man named Marcus Chen who kept to himself, that he was going to the recreation area every night after his shift ended. Instead, he'd sneak into the service tunnel and go to the cavity, where he would work for 2 or 3 hours before going back to his cell. The work was taking a long time. Very slow. He'd spend hours on one part some nights, only to have it fail during testing. He would have to start over looking for new materials and trying new things. But slowly and against all odds, a starship began to take shape. First came the hull. Kale couldn't make new metal because he didn't have the right tools or materials. Instead, he used structural plating from the mine itself for a different purpose. The tunnels were lined with Durasteel panels to keep them from collapsing. They were also modular and held together by magnetic clamps. Kale would carefully take a panel off of a remote tunnel and replace it with rock held in place by epoxy, hoping no one would notice before he got away. Then he would take the panel to his hole. The ship he made was a cylinder that was about 40 feet long and 12 feet wide. Small and cramped, but in theory it could hold one person for a short trip. During those long nights, the hull panels were welded together, and each seam was carefully sealed and checked for air leaks. The life support system was probably the most important one. The ship would be a flying coffin without it. Kale took apart 3 atmospheric processors from different parts of the mine and took the most important parts from each. He made a closed-loop system that would clean carbon dioxide, recycle air and water, and make oxygen through electrolysis. It was rough compared to commercial life support systems, but it worked in his tests. The tests were very stressful. Kale would lock himself in a small part of the ship's hull, turn on the life support, and check the air quality for hours, ready to stop if anything went wrong. The first few tests didn't work because the CO2 levels rose too quickly, the oxygen generator got too hot, or the pressure seals leaked. But every time he failed, he learned something and improved the system. The life support system worked by the time he had been at Sigma 9 for 8 months. Kale had been breathing air that he had made himself for 6 hours straight without any problems. He felt very happy at that moment. The next problem was propulsion, and it was the hardest one. He needed a lot of thrust to get away from the asteroid's weak gravity and speed up enough to travel between planets. He couldn't build fusion drives or ion engines, which were used by commercial ships. But mining tools used controlled explosions all the time. The mine used explosives to break up rock formations that were very hard. The charges were tightly controlled, stored in a safe vault, and checked in and out with very detailed records. Kale didn't need the charges themselves, he needed to understand why they were made. He started learning about the mining explosives, how they were used, and the chemical reactions that happened. And then he realized that he didn't need to steal bombs. He could make his own propellant with things that were already in the mine. There was ice in the asteroid, which is water that had frozen and was trapped in the rock. The mine's machines took this water out so the facility could use it. But you could split water into hydrogen and oxygen, and when you mixed those 2 gases together in the right way, they made a great rocket fuel. Kale made an electrolysis system to get the gases out and separate them. He made storage tanks out of compressed gas cylinders that were used for welding in the mine. He made a combustion chamber out of heat-resistant ceramics he found at or smelters. He made an ignition system out of electrical relays and spark plugs. The engine was huge compared to the rest of the ship. It took up almost a third of the ship's length. But Kale's math showed that the numbers worked. The thrust-to-weight ratio was barely good enough, but it would do. It was impossible to test the engine. The sound and energy signature would be picked up right away. Kale would only get one chance to fire it, and that would be during the escape. It would either work or it wouldn't. There would be no second chances. Next came systems for navigation and control. Kale had to be able to steer the ship, know where he was going, and stay away from things in space. He took gyroscopes from mining drones, made a simple inertial navigation system, and programmed a guidance computer with his own terminal. He used mining scanners as sensors. These machines were made to find mineral deposits, but they could also find big things like asteroids or ships. It wasn't high-tech, but it would help him see where he was going. The control interface was probably the easiest part. Kale made a pilot seat out of a mining vehicle's chair and put it in the middle of salvaged displays and control panels. He had wired the ship's different systems with switches, buttons, and levers he had gathered over the course of months. It looked like a spacecraft from 100 years ago with all its manual controls and analog readouts, but it would work. The ship was 70% done by the 10th month of his sentence. It had a hull, life support, propulsion, navigation, and basic controls. It didn't have any style. The welding wasn't very good, the wiring was open and easy to break, and the systems weren't very well connected. But it was a boat. Kale had built a spaceship out of trash and willpower, even though it seemed impossible. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. It began with paranoia. He froze every time he heard an unexpected sound in the tunnels. He wondered if the guards knew every time they looked at him. But over time he came to understand that it wasn't paranoia. Someone or something knew about his project. The signs weren't very clear. Things he had hidden would be moved a little bit. He would find a tool he had left in one place in a different place. He once found new boot prints in the dust near the entrance to his secret tunnel. They weren't his own. Kale was determined to find out who the intruder was. He set up traps like hair-thin wires across doorways, dust patterns that would show if someone had been there, and small markers that would show if someone had been in his spaces. And then one night in his 11th month he learned who it was. Kale was welding a support strut to the hull in the hole when he heard a noise behind him. He turned around and grabbed a heavy wrench to use as a weapon. His heart was racing. There was a person standing at the entrance to his secret tunnel. For a moment they were frozen in place, Kale with his makeshift weapon raised and the intruder with his hands spread out in a calming gesture. Then the figure stepped into the light and Kale's jaw dropped. Vera Santos, one of the women prisoners, was the one. Everyone knew Kale by sight. Everyone at Sigma 9 knew Vera. She had been here for 12 years, longer than almost anyone else, and had been found guilty of corporate espionage. She was in her late 40s, had iron gray hair and sharp, smart eyes that saw everything. "Easy, Vincent," Vera said in a calm voice. "I'm not going to turn you in." Kale didn't let go of the wrench. "How long have you known?" "About 4 months." Vera stepped into the hole and looked at the ship with a critical eye. "You hide well but not well enough. I've been keeping an eye on things that have gone missing for a while. It took me a while to figure out where they went. Why are you here if you're not going to turn me in?" Vera turned to look at him, and Kale saw something in her face that surprised him. Respect and maybe a little hope. "Because," she said, "that ship you're building isn't big enough for one person to make it to the nearest inhabited system. But it might be big enough for 2. Kale looked at her. "Do you want to help?" "I want to get away," Vera said. "And I can help you finish what you've started. Before I came here I was a systems architect. I know how to put together complicated systems, make them run better, and fix problems you haven't even thought of yet." She pointed to the ship. "Kale, you've already done the impossible. You've built most of a working spacecraft out of garbage. But you need help with the last steps. And I need a way off this rock before I die here." Kale looked at her for a long time. In a place like Sigma 9, trust was a risky thing to have. There were informants everywhere, and they promised shorter sentences for information about escape attempts. But Vera had been here for 12 years. She only had 3 years left to serve. She would have already told if she was going to do it for the time off. Kale slowly let the wrench down. He asked, "Why do you think you can trust me?" Vera smiled, but her face looked tired and full of hard-earned wisdom. "Because I've been in this hellhole for 12 years watching good people break and bad people thrive. I've learned to read people, Vincent. You're not a criminal. You're just someone who got screwed by the system, just like me." She walked over to the ship's control panel and looked at what Kale had done. "Besides, I've already made a promise. I haven't told anyone about you, which makes me an accomplice. We're in this together now, whether you want my help or not." Kale felt the stress leave his shoulders. He had been carrying this weight alone for 11 months, working alone and not trusting anyone. The idea of having a friend who understood what he was trying to do was almost too much for him to handle. "Okay," he said. "What do you think needs to be fixed?" Vera's smile got bigger. "How do I even begin?" Vera showed her worth 100 times over in the weeks that followed. She found serious problems with Kale's designs, like places where systems would break down under stress, calculations that were off by important margins, and weak spots in the hull structure. She also brought things that Kale couldn't get to, like parts from the women's section of the building and tools that were better for delicate work. More importantly, she gave them hope. Having someone to help with the work and come up with ideas for how to solve problems turned the project from a long shot that seemed impossible into something that seemed almost doable. They worked together to make the ship better. They made the hull stronger in places where it was weak. They made the life support system work 30% better. They made a backup navigation system in case the main one broke. They even built a small cargo bay, which took up some of the space inside to store extra food, water and oxygen that they found in the facility's supplies. They also started to plan how to get away. They didn't just need to build the ship, they also needed to get it out of the asteroid and away before the guards could catch them. Vera had a thought. The supply ship, she said one night while they were working. It comes every 6 months. The next one is due in 73 days. What's up with it? When the supply ship arrives, the facility goes into high alert. All prisoners are locked down, and all guards are focused on moving the cargo. This is the only time when the internal security is less strict because everyone is watching the outside perimeter. Kale saw where she was headed. We start during the transfer of supplies. Exactly. We'll have about 20 minutes between the start of the lockdown and when they figure out we're gone. That's our chance. It was dangerous. They would have been caught right away if they launched while a supply ship was docked. But it also meant that the guards would be confused, take longer to respond, and not know what to do. The chaos could be just what they needed to hide. 73 days. They had just over 2 months to finish the ship and get ready for the most dangerous bet of their lives. They worked with a new sense of urgency. They spent all their free time in the cavity, welding, wiring, testing, and improving. Kale and Vera got into a rhythm, anticipating each other's needs and moving through the small workspace with synchronized efficiency. The ship was finished by day 60. The hull was made up of panels that didn't match, the inside was small and practical, and the controls looked like they belonged in a museum. But it worked. All of the systems had been checked. All of the math had been checked. There was a backup for every backup. They gave her the name Redemption. It seemed right. On the last day, Kale and Vera checked every seal, connection, and part one last time. This is really happening, Vera said softly as she ran her hand along the hull. I'm really going to leave this place after 12 years. Kale nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. 3 days until the ship with supplies gets here. 3 days until we're either dead or free. For a moment, they stood in silence, 2 prisoners in a hidden hole in an asteroid, staring at a spaceship they had built out of trash and dreams. Kale, Vera said, thank you for letting me be a part of this. No matter what happens, I at least tried. I didn't just give up and rot here. Kale looked her in the eye. We're going to make it, Vera? We didn't get this far to fail now. 3 days. 72 hours. And then they would either fly free or die trying. The engineer's plan was almost done. The last act was about to start. The last 3 days before the supply ship got there were the longest of Kale's life. Every second felt like it was going to last forever, and every moment was full of the chance to find something new. He and Vera went about their daily lives as if nothing was wrong, afraid that any change would alert the guards. But they were getting ready for war on the inside. The ship was ready, but getting it out of the hole and into the right spot for launch was the last big problem that needed to be solved. The cavity was deep inside the asteroid and could only be reached through the narrow service tunnel that Kale had dug. The passage was way too small for the ship to fly through. They needed a different way out. Kale had found a possible answer weeks before. There was about 60 feet of solid rock directly above the hole that kept them from reaching the asteroid's surface. They could make a launch shaft, a vertical tunnel that Redemption could use to get away, if they could blast through that rock. The hard part was doing it without letting everyone in the building know. Vera knew what to do. We don't need to blast through all at once, she said. We weaken it little by little and then we launch it at the same time as the final breakthrough. The blast will hide our engine's signature. They had been drilling narrow holes up through the rock for the past month. When nearby tunnels were busy with loud machines that would cover the sound, they used a salvaged mining laser. The holes made a perfect pattern like the holes in a piece of paper. There was just enough homemade explosive in each hole to break the rock when they were set off one after the other. Kale and Vera finished getting ready on the morning of the 73rd day. They put their small amount of supplies into Redemption's cargo bay, 20 gallons of water, compressed rations they had stolen over the course of months, extra oxygen canisters, emergency medical supplies and a few personal items. Kale brought a data chip with proof that he was wrongfully convicted. He wanted to clear his name if they made it to civilization. Vera brought a picture of her daughter, whom she hadn't seen in 12 years. The supply ship was supposed to dock at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. The facility lockdown would start at 13:50, giving the guards 10 minutes to lock up all the prisoners before the outside doors opened. Kale and Vera left their jobs at 1:30. That day, Kale had volunteered to take out the trash, which no one else wanted to do, so he was on his own. Vera was sent to the water reclamation plant, where she had planned a malfunction that would keep the plant supervisor busy fixing things instead of keeping an eye on her. At 13:35, they met at the entrance to the service tunnel. Both were out of breath and their hearts were racing. This was it. There's no going back now. For the last time, they squeezed through the tunnel and came out into the space where redemption was waiting. The ship looked almost beautiful in the harsh work lights they had put up. It was a sign of how smart and determined people are to never give up. Cale said, "Final systems check," as he climbed into the small cockpit. Vera followed and sat down in the seat next to the pilot. They went through the list they had memorized. Life support, green. Green for power. Green for navigation. Green propulsion. Armed with explosive charges. Ready for the detonator. At 13:50, the alarm for the whole facility went off, signaling a lockdown. They could barely hear the klaxon through the solid rock around them. It was a distant wailing that told every prisoner to go back to their cells. Cale's hands moved over the control panel, starting the launch sequence. He said, 60 seconds to ignition. Vera held on to the armrests and looked pale but determined. 12 years, she said softly. 60 seconds of freedom for 12 years. Cale's homemade computer on the ship started its countdown. 50 seconds. 45. 40. They heard the security chief of the facility say, "All sectors report lockdown complete," through the communication system they had hacked into. "The supply ship will arrive in 5 minutes. 30 seconds. Cale," Vera said, "if this doesn't work, it will work." 20 seconds. Cale's finger was just above the switch that would set off the bomb. This would set off the explosives in the rock above, blowing up their way out. It would also let everyone in the building know that they had escaped. A quarter of a minute. He thought about what had happened in the last year of his life. The hopelessness, the hard work, and the slow change from broken prisoner to defiant engineer. Every drop of sweat, every time you were scared, and every little win had brought you to this point. 10 seconds. The computer said in a flat, synthesized voice, "Ignition sequence started." 5 seconds. Cale pushed the button to set off the bomb. There was a lot of noise and anger in the world. The charges went off one after the other, breaking the rock above them in a carefully planned pattern. A vertical shaft opened above them, letting dust and debris fall into the hole. The shaft was rough and jagged, but it was wide enough. Cale could see stars through the hole. Not the dim lights in the tunnel where he had lived for a year. He couldn't breathe when he saw it that he yelled, "Main engine ignition." Over the noise, the chemical rocket engine lit up with a sound like thunder being born. When hydrogen and oxygen mixed in the combustion chamber, they made a lot of thrust, heat, and noise that made Cale's ears ring even through his helmet. Redemption shook, trembled, and then started to rise. The acceleration was brutal because Cale had made the engine for maximum thrust, not comfort. The ship shot up through the blast shaft, slamming him and Vera back into their seats. The rough walls flashed by, still glowing red-hot from the explosions. Redemption's hull scraped against a rock that was sticking out, which made the whole structure shake. Then they were done, bursting out of the asteroid's surface like a bullet from a gun. Vera yelled, "We're clear. We're really clear." But they still weren't safe. Cale could see the supply ship, a big cargo ship that was about a mile away from Sigma 9's docking port, through the viewport. 3 security drones were already on their way to stop it. "They see us," Cale said, changing their course. "Wait a minute." The security drones were quick and made to respond quickly. They quickly closed the gap and their weapon systems came to life. These weren't shock batons that didn't kill people. They were ship-grade lasers that were meant to stop bad ships. A red beam shot through space, missing Redemption by a few meters. Cale made the ship move in a crazy way to avoid the asteroid, using the asteroid's low gravity to do things that would have been impossible near a planet. Another laser blast, this time closer. Cale could feel the heat through the hull. "Vera, give all the power you can to the engine," he yelled. Vera's hands moved quickly over her control panel. "Rerouting life support reserves and turning off systems that aren't needed. You have an extra 90 seconds of power. That will have to be enough." Cale turned on the main engine at full power. Redemption jumped ahead and the speed went up to more than 4 gs. He and Vera grunted against the pressure, trying to stay awake as their blood pooled at the back of their heads. The security drones fell behind. They were fast, but Redemption was lighter and could speed up faster. The space between them grew, 1 mile, 2 miles, 5 miles. But then the ship that brought supplies moved. The big cargo ship turned and the main engine started to glow. It was going to chase them. "Shit," Cale said under his breath. The supply ship was bigger, but its engines were made for business. It would catch up to them eventually if they raced in a straight line. Vera, plot a course through the field of asteroids. Vera's eyes got bigger. Kale, our sensors aren't working at all. We're going to get smashed. If the supply ship follows you, it will too. It can't take the same risks we can because its collision avoidance systems won't let it. There were thousands of rock fragments in the asteroid field around Sigma 9, some as small as pebbles and others as big as buildings. They were all tumbling through space in random orbits, making it hard for a navigator to find their way. Commercial ships stayed away from it completely, taking long routes around the field. But Redemption wasn't a ship that carried goods. The man who flew the escape craft was desperate and had nothing to lose. Kale jumped into the field. Alarms started going off right away. Rocks flew by on all sides, some so close that Kale could see how rough they were. He flew on instinct and calculation, with his engineer's mind quickly figuring out trajectories and speeds and finding the spaces between life and death. The supply ship behind them slowed down and didn't want to follow. The security drones tried, but one hit a spinning rock and fell over, breaking down. The other two stopped chasing. They were done. They were really done. Kale kept the maximum thrust going for 10 more minutes, putting as much space as possible between them and Sigma 9. When he finally slowed down, they were 50,000 miles from the prison asteroid and moving at a speed that would get them to the nearest inhabited system in about 8 months. 8 months in a small, jury-rigged spaceship with barely enough life support and no room for mistakes. But they would be free. Kale unbuckled from his seat, and his whole body shook with adrenaline and tiredness. Vera was crying, and the tears were floating in the air because the engine had stopped. "We did it," she said, her voice breaking. "Kale, we really did it." Kale looked out the window and saw the stars spread out in front of them. Stars he had always wanted to see from outside of a prison cell. Stars that seemed so far away just a year ago. He thought about the 47 people who had died when the life support system on Mars Colony 7 broke down. He thought about the real saboteurs who had set him up and gotten away with it. He thought about the year of hard work, pain, and despair that he had to go through. And he thought about the ship around him, made of trash and willpower, which showed how people refused to give up. "This isn't over," Kale said in a low voice. "We still have to get to civilization. We still have to live in this thing for 8 months. And then I have to clear my name and make sure the people who did this get what they deserve." Vera nodded and wiped her eyes. "Kale, one step at a time. But we did it first. We got away from an asteroid mine that was supposed to be impossible to get out of. That means we can do anything." Kale smiled a little. She was correct. They had made the impossible happen. They had turned a cosmic jail cell into a forge, making their prison their salvation. Every bolt that had been thrown away and every circuit that had been forgotten had become a part of the impossible puzzle. And now they had figured it out. Redemption drifted through the void. It was a small, damaged spaceship with 2 people on board who would not give up. Behind them, Sigma 9 was a fading point of light, like a tomb they had escaped from. The unknown lay ahead. Problems, threats, maybe even death. But also a chance. Liberty. Hope. The journey of the rock-built Starship had just begun. The first week of the trip was eye-opening. The ship's rough accommodations made Redemption feel like a luxury after a year of living in a small cell with 200 other prisoners. But they quickly realized how bad things really were. Kale and Vera were flying through deep space in a spaceship that was held together by makeshift welds and hope. The life support systems had never been made to work for 8 months straight. They made a plan. One of them would check the air quality, water recycling, power levels, hull integrity, and navigation accuracy every 4 hours. They spent the rest of their time doing maintenance, repairs, and keeping an eye on a spacecraft that was barely working. The life support system needed to be checked on all the time. On the 9th day, the CO2 scrubber started to break down, putting their air at risk of being poisoned within hours. Kale spent 12 scary hours rebuilding the chemical filters with spare parts. Vera stayed in a makeshift safe zone, with an emergency oxygen supply, ready to bring him back to life if he passed out from carbon dioxide poisoning. On the 15th day, a micrometeorite hit the hull and made a hole the size of a fingernail in one of the outer panels. The loss of pressure was slow but steady. They spent 2 days making a patch out of melted-down metal scraps. They put it on from the outside during a terrifying spacewalk, where Kale worked in the cold and silence of space, with only one cable connecting him to the ship. But they made it. They changed. They got smarter. And as the days turned into weeks, something strange happened. They started to get better. During the long, quiet times when systems were stable and there was nothing to do but wait, Kale found himself talking to Vera. He told her about his life before he was found guilty, including his work on Mars Colony 7, how proud he was of making systems that kept people alive, and how devastated he was when those same systems failed. "I made those atmospheric processors so that they couldn't break," he said one night while floating in the crew compartment's zero gravity. "Multiple backups, failsafes and redundancies. They should not have failed the way they did." "But they did fail," Vera said softly. "Someone made sure of it." "Marcus Torbin," Cale said, and the name tasted bad in his mouth. "My boss. He was cutting corners and using cheap parts to make money. He got to the system first when I found out and told him I would report him. Sabotaged my work and made it look like my changes caused the failure." "Can you show me?" Cale touched the data chip in his pocket. It was the only thing he had brought with him from prison besides clothes. "Maybe." I had proof, like logs showing the changes in parts and messages between Torbin and his suppliers. But a lot of it was lost during the investigation. "I saved this chip, but I'm not sure if it's enough." For a moment, Vera didn't say anything. After that, she said, "I know how it feels to be let down by someone you thought you could trust. My partner, who is not a romantic partner but a business partner, set me up. We owned a business that analyzed data, and she was selling our clients' private information to other businesses. She made me look like the thief when I found out. Had evidence planted and witnesses ready. I didn't see it coming." "Did you try to stop it?" "Sure. But she was smarter and less kind than I was. It was too late by the time I figured out what she had done." The story was set. Vera Santos, a corporate spy who broke trust. She laughed in a bitter way. "The funny thing is that if I had really stolen and sold what they said I did, I would have made enough money to leave. I didn't do the crime, but I got 12 years on an asteroid instead." They floated in comfortable silence, two people who had been wronged and were determined to take back their lives. Their talks got deeper as the weeks went by. They talked about philosophy, what they would do when they got to civilization, and what justice, revenge, and redemption really are. Vera had a daughter named Emma, who was 9 years old when Vera was found guilty. She would be 21 now, a woman Vera had missed seeing grow up. Vera said in a soft voice, "I wrote her letters. I wrote to Emma every week for 12 years. I don't know if she ever got them. The prison said they would bring them, but..." She stopped talking. "What did you say to her?" Cale wanted to know. "That I was not guilty. That I cared about her. That I was her mother and proud of her, no matter what anyone else said." Vera's eyes were far away. "And I told her stories. About the asteroid, the stars I could see through the observation port, and the other prisoners. I wanted her to know that even in the worst place, there could be beauty and kindness." Cale said, "You'll see her again when we get to port. If she'll see me. She is now an adult. Maybe she's moved on, or maybe she believes the lies about me. Maybe she would be better off without the stain of having a mother who is a convicted felon. Or maybe," Cale said with conviction, "she's been waiting for you to come home for 12 years. They had formed a good working relationship by the 6th week. Cale took care of the mechanical and engineering problems, and Vera took care of the computer systems and logistics. They worked together to keep redemption flying. But on the 42nd day, disaster almost happened. When Cale woke up, he saw Vera working frantically at the navigation console. Her face was pale. He asked, "What's wrong?" and was instantly on guard. "We're off course," Vera said in a tight voice. "For the past week, the navigation computer has been drifting. I thought I had made up for it, but the mistake keeps getting worse. We're now 3 degrees off the path we wanted to take." 3 degrees doesn't sound like a lot. 3 degrees puts us hundreds of thousands of miles from our destination after 8 months of travel. We won't even see the station, we'll just float into deep space. Cale pulled himself up to the console and looked over the data. Vera was right, the navigational drift was bad. The gyroscopes he had taken from mining drones weren't made for long-term, accurate navigation. They were slowly failing, which caused mistakes that got worse over time. Cale said, "We need to recalibrate. Use stellar navigation to check our position against known stars, and then manually change the course." Vera said, "We don't have the tools for stellar navigation. I can see the stars, but I can't figure out exactly where we are in relation to them." Cale took a moment to think. Then he thought of something. "We make one. A sextant is a tool that sailors have used for hundreds of years to find their way by the stars. The idea is simple. Find the angle between a star and the horizon. We don't have a horizon in space. We use the direction of the ship as our reference plane. We find out where we are by measuring the angles between known stars and comparing them to stellar charts." It took 3 days to put together a working sextant out of a broken telescope lens, a protractor that had been rescued from the ship's tools, and a level. It was rough and their measurements were very wrong, but it worked. Kale and Vera spent a week carefully mapping their location with their makeshift sextant. They figured out where they were, how much they needed to change their course, and then fired the maneuvering thrusters. When they were done, they were tired but back on track. 2 months down, Vera said as she looked at their schedule. 6 left. The trip went on. They carefully rationed their food to make it last longer. They reused every drop of water and every breath of air. They learned to take turns sleeping so that they were never both unconscious at the same time in case of an emergency. And the destination got closer and closer. By the 4th month, they could pick up radio signals from Port Meridian, the mining station they were trying to reach. The signals were weak, just whispers of electromagnetic radiation, but they were there. This was proof that civilization was ahead of them. 4 months, Kale said as he listened to the transmissions full of static. We're halfway there. But their happiness didn't last long. On the 131st day, the water recycling system broke down in a big way. A seal in the main filtration unit broke, sending their precious water supply into the cabin. In zero gravity, the water made floating globules, which looked like shimmering spheres moving through the air. Kale and Vera rushed to stop the water from getting out, using towels and suction devices to grab as much as they could. But they had lost almost 30% of their water supply by the time they sealed the leak and cleaned up the mess. They did the math in the cabin, which was full of wet towels and smelled like recycled water. 4 months left, Vera said in a low voice. 70% of our water is still there. If we cut back on what we use to the bare minimum, we'll still run out 2 weeks before we get there, Kale said to finish. They looked at each other and the truth hit them. They had come so far and been through so much, and now they were going to die of thirst right next to help. Unless they came up with a different way. Kale spent 3 days working on the issue. The water they had lost was gone. It had evaporated into space through the cabin's air recycling system before they could catch it. There was no way to get it back. They needed a different source. And then he remembered the asteroid. They had loaded Redemption's cargo bay with a lot of big pieces of asteroid rock. Kale had planned to look at these samples for valuable minerals that could help them make money when they got to port. Like the asteroid they had mined, those rocks had ice in them. Kale could get that ice, melt it, clean it, and use it to fill up their water supply. The process was hard. They had to use the ship's limited heating systems to melt the ice that was stuck in the rock. Then they had to run the water through makeshift filters to get rid of any dirt. It took days of hard work, doing small amounts at a time. But it worked. They took enough water from the asteroid samples over the course of 2 weeks to replace what they had lost and have a small reserve. Vera joked, "We're ice miners again," as she watched Kale chip away at another rock sample. "We got away from an asteroid mine, but now we're mining asteroids in our spaceship." Kale laughed, which surprised him. He hadn't really laughed in a long time. "At least this time we're keeping the money." The 5th month was over. 6th month. They were thin now because they were eating their own bodies to make the little food they had last longer. They moved slowly to save energy and slept more to cut down on the calories they needed. But they were getting closer. The radio signals from Port Meridian got stronger. They could now hear individual transmissions like cargo manifests, docking procedures, and casual conversations between station staff. They were going to do it. Kale made a choice on day 215. He turned on their communications system, which had been off until now to save power and avoid being found, and started sending. "This is the ship Redemption calling Port Meridian. We are a private boat asking for help docking in an emergency. We have 2 people on board and are running low on supplies. Please answer." They stayed put. Radio waves moved at the speed of light, but they were still weeks away from the station. Their message would take hours to get to Port Meridian and get a response. The answer came 16 hours later. "Redemption, this is Port Meridian Traffic Control. We can hear you. Send us your ship's registration and flight plan." Kale and Vera stared at each other. Registering a ship? Plan for the flight? They were running away on a spaceship that wasn't registered and was made out of trash. Kale typed in the code for the transmitter. "Port Meridian, we don't have a standard way to register. This may sound strange, but we're escaped prisoners from Facility Sigma 9. We made this ship ourselves and now we're looking for asylum." A long pause. "Redemption, please wait," they said. They were nervous as they waited. This was it, the moment when civilization would either help them or leave them alone. "Redemption, Port Meridian Control," came in 20 minutes later. "We have talked to Facility Sigma 9 and confirmed your story. They say that 2 prisoners got away 3 months ago. Please be aware that there is a warrant for your arrest. But we're not a prison, we're a civilian station. We'll let you dock in an emergency, but security will be there. Do you understand?" Kale thought about it. They could try to run away and find another port, but they were almost out of food. This was the only real choice they had. Copy that, Port Meridian. We will give up peacefully. We just want to live. Got it, Redemption. Sending docking approach vectors now. Welcome to Port Meridian. And what about Redemption? One more thing. Go ahead. The engineering team here is very interested in seeing your ship. They're saying that what you did, building a working spaceship out of mining tools, is impossible. They want to know how you did it. Kale smiled. Say it's easy. You just need the right drive. The last few weeks of the trip were both good and bad. They were going to make it, get to civilization, but they would probably be caught and sent back to jail. They would still get their day in court. They would have a chance to show their proof and fight their wrong convictions. They would have done the impossible. On day 243, Port Meridian appeared in their viewport. It was a shiny station orbiting a small moon, and its docking arms were outstretched to welcome them. Kale helped Redemption land by keeping his hands steady on controls that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. The ship, made from asteroid dust and broken dreams, was finishing its first and only trip. Kale could see the faces of the station staff waiting for them as they docked through the viewport. Some looked doubtful, others amazed, and everyone was interested in the two prisoners who had turned rocks into a starship. We did it, Vera said in a low voice. Kale, we really did it. The airlock was the same on both sides. The door opened. A lot of engineers and station workers were also waiting, their faces full of awe and respect. Kale and Vera stepped through. Their legs were shaky from months of being in zero gravity, their bodies were weak from not eating enough, but their spirits were still strong. They were sent to an asteroid mine where they were supposed to dig until they died. Instead, they dug their way to freedom and built a starship out of the rocks that were supposed to be their grave. What had seemed impossible had become possible. The trip was over. But their story was just getting started. Port Meridian's jails were nicer than Sigma 9's, but they were still cages. As soon as Kale and Vera docked, they were taken to separate holding cells while the station's officials figured out what to do with them. Kale's cell was small but clean. There was a Real bed, clean water, and 3 meals a day. It felt almost like a luxury after months of going without on Redemption. But the door was still locked and the walls were still closed. He was still locked up. No one came for 3 days except the guards who brought food. Kale took the time to rest because his body was slowly getting better from the trip. He also used it to plan his next steps and think. On the 4th day, the door to the cell opened and a woman in her 50s with the badge of a Port Meridian administrative official walked in. She had a data tablet with her and looked tired, like she'd had enough of red tape. Kale Vinson, she said, sitting across from him at the small table in the cell. Hello, I'm Helen Reeves, the administrator. We need to talk about what you're going through. Am I going back to Sigma 9? Kale asked directly. That depends. Facility Sigma 9 has asked you to come back right away. However, Port Meridian has the right to do its own investigation before carrying out a transfer warrant, especially in cases where there may have been safety violations or claims of wrongful conviction. Kale's heart raced. Are you looking into my case? We're looking into your escape, Reeves said. The fact that you made a working spaceship out of mining tools has raised serious questions about Sigma 9's safety rules. What other mistakes have they made if their security was so bad that prisoners could build a ship that could escape? She tapped on her tablet. I've gone over the basics of your conviction. Systems engineer for Mars Colony 7, where a life support failure led to the deaths of 47 people. You said that your boss, Marcus Torbin, sabotaged you? I didn't say it. I showed it. Or I did, but the proof went away. Tell me everything, Reeves said as she turned on the recorder on her tablet. And I mean everything. Names, dates, technical details, and communications. I want to know everything. Kale spoke for 2 hours. He talked about the atmospheric processors, the changes he had made to make them safer and more efficient, and the bad parts that Torbin had been using. He talked about how he found out about the scheme, confronted Torbin, and was threatened. He went into great detail about the sabotage, explaining how someone had gotten into his systems and changed the code, which created weaknesses that led to the disaster. Kale said, I had logs. Records of communication between Torbin and his suppliers, system access logs showing changes that weren't allowed, and purchase orders for the bad parts. I told my defense lawyer everything. And? The files were broken before the trial. In a strange way. All of my proof was gone. My lawyer said it was a technical problem, but I know better. Torbin had money and connections. He made sure that nothing could touch him. Reeves wrote down things on her tablet. You said you still have something on a chip. Kale took the chip out of his things and gave it to her. Not much. A few backup logs that I had saved to my own storage. But it shows how Torben talked to people, which proves that he was in touch with the part suppliers during the time in question. Reeves put the chip into her tablet and looked over the information. She looked like she was thinking. This isn't a sure thing, but it's a start. It points to possible areas for further study. She looked up at Kale. This is what I can give you. Port Meridian will look over your case in full, which will take about 90 days. Instead of sending you back to Sigma 9, we'll keep you here during that time. We can ask for a new trial if we find strong evidence that the conviction was wrong. And what if you don't? Then you go back to Sigma 9 to finish your time. Reeves' face softened a little. But Mr. Vinson, I've been doing this job for 20 years. I know how to tell when someone is lying. Your story is consistent, detailed, and emotionally real. I want to believe you. But faith isn't proof. She got up to leave, but then she stopped. One more thing. The engineers here are very interested in your ship. They want to be able to study it so they can figure out how you did what you did. I think I should give them permission. Do you have any problems with that? Kale gave it some thought. Just one condition. I want to be a part of it. I made redemption. I want to explain the systems myself if they're going to study her. Reeves smiled. I believe that can be done. Might even be good for you. Dr. Marcus Wu, the chief engineer here, is very well thought of. If he agrees with your technical knowledge, it backs up your claim to be a skilled engineer instead of a careless one. Kale felt the first stirrings of real hope after Reeves left. Not getting away this time, but something better. Justice. 2 days later, guards took him to one of Port Meridian's engineering bays, where they had moved Redemption for analysis. Kale was proud to see his ship, which was battered, rough, but still in one piece. A group of engineers surrounded the ship, taking measurements, pictures of parts, and looking at how it was built. Dr. Marcus Wu, a man in his 60s with gray hair and sharp, smart eyes, was in charge of them. Wu walked up to Kale with a look of respect and disbelief on his face. Mr. Vinson, I've worked as an aerospace engineer for 40 years. I've made plans for commercial freighters, military ships, and even experimental ships. And I have to say that what you've done here is amazing. He pointed at Redemption. This ship shouldn't work. The design of the engine is decades old. The life support system is made up of parts that were put together in a hurry. The hull is a patchwork that would never pass a safety test. But you flew it through deep space for 8 months and made it safely. Wu brought up a holographic display that showed detailed scans of the ship. I want you to show me how every system works. I want to know how you think about design and how you solve problems. To be honest, some of the solutions you've come up with are great. For example, this thermal recycling system works better than commercial models that cost 10 times what you paid. For the next week, Kale spent hours with Wu and his team going over how Redemption systems worked. He talked about the problems he had to deal with, the limits he had to work within, and the new ideas that came out of need and desperation. The engineers paid close attention. They asked him technical questions, questioned his reasoning, and checked his knowledge. And with each answer Kale gave, it became clearer that he was not a careless hack. He was a talented and creative engineer who really understood how systems worked. Wu wrote a formal report to Administrator Reeves that made it clear that Kale Vinson was an excellent engineer. The report said, "We believe that Mr. Vinson's technical skills are far above what is needed to safely maintain atmospheric processors. The skill level he has shown doesn't match up with the catastrophic failure he was found guilty of causing." Reeves used that report to get what he wanted from the court system: access to the original case files from Kale's trial. She also started looking into Marcus Torben's business and financial records. At the same time, Kale was only allowed to use communication systems in a limited way. He called his sister Emma Vinson first. He hadn't talked to her in more than a year. Emma's face came up on the screen and she looked shocked. "Kale? Oh my God, Kale. I thought you were in jail and couldn't talk to me," they said. "I was," Kale said, his voice full of emotion. "I'm out, Emma. Not free yet, but I'm at Port Meridian. I got away from Sigma 9. Emma put her hand over her mouth. "You got away? Oh, it's a long story. But I need your help. I need you to find someone who worked with me on Mars Colony 7 who might be willing to testify about Torben's corruption. Kale, everyone there thought you were guilty. Torben got a promotion after the disaster. Now he's in charge of operations." Kale's jaw tightened. Torben had, of course, been given a raise. He had killed his opponent and hidden his crimes. There has to be someone. Someone who saw something and thought it was strange. Emma, 47 people died because he wanted too much. Someone must know the truth. Emma nodded slowly. "I'll do my best. I'll get in touch with your former co-workers and see if anyone will talk. But Kale, be careful. If Torben finds out you're looking into him again, let him hear, Kale said angrily. I'm not hiding anymore. In another detention cell across the station, Vera was fighting her own battles. Her case was more complicated because corporate espionage carried harsher penalties and powerful business interests didn't want old cases reopened. But Vera had one thing going for her, her daughter. Emma Santos did get letters from her mother. All 12 years worth. She had kept all of them and read them over and over again, never giving up hope that her mother was innocent. Emma quickly booked a ride to the station when she found out that her mother had gotten away and was at Port Meridian. There was no force in the universe that could have stopped her from getting back together. The meeting took place in a room for supervised visits. Vera sat there, shaking her hands, not believing what she was seeing. Emma came in through the door after that. She was a woman now 21, but Vera could still see the 9-year-old girl she used to know. When Emma saw her mother, her eyes filled with tears. "Mom," she whispered, and then they hugged, ending 12 years of being apart in an instant. They talked for a long time. Emma told her mom about everything that was going on in her life, like college, her job as a data analyst, and the ups and downs of growing up. Vera told Emma about the escape, Kale and redemption, and the journey that was impossible. Emma said, "I never stopped believing you were innocent. People told me to get over you and move on. But I did know. I knew you wouldn't do that to people." Emma had been doing her own research on her mother's case for years, quietly collecting information. She had found problems with the prosecution's evidence, such as timelines that didn't match up and witnesses who had changed their stories. Emma said with a small smile, "I'm a data analyst. I know how to find patterns and see things that don't fit. There were lies in the case against you. I just have to show it." Mother and daughter started to make plans together. Emma would work from outside the station, using her skills to find out more about Vera's ex-partner's business dealings. Vera would help Administrator Reeves from the inside by giving them technical information and guiding them in the right direction. After 6 weeks in detention, Kale and Vera were finally able to talk to each other in a conference room under supervision. "How are you doing?" Kale asked. "Better than at Sigma 9, Vera said with a sly smile. "Emma is here. I got to see my daughter, Kale. Whatever happens now, that alone made it all worth it." Kale said, "Reeves is making progress on my case. They've found money transfers between Torben and the suppliers of parts. It's not enough for a new trial yet, but it's a start." Vera nodded. "Emma has found similar proof in my case. My ex wasn't as careful as she thought she was. If you know where to look, there's a trail." They were quiet for a moment, two people who had been through a lot together and were now fighting their own battles but working toward the same goal. Kale said, "No matter what happens, we made it this far. They told us we couldn't get away, but we did. They called me a careless engineer, but I built a working Starship out of trash. We can prove we're innocent if we can do that." Vera agreed, "We're not done yet. The trip goes on. In a different way though." The guard told them their time was up. Kale felt more determined than ever as they said goodbye. It wasn't just about getting out of a physical prison that people fought for freedom. It was about getting out of the prison of false conviction, stolen reputation, and unfairness. And that battle had just begun. The investigation moved slowly, which was very frustrating for Kale. Every day was a test of how patient I could be. He was still in custody at Port Meridian, but his health kept getting better. Administrator Reeves had moved him to a residential area of the station. He was still safe, but it was more comfortable and he could use computers, talk to people, and read. Kale made use of all the resources at his disposal. He spent hours drawing technical diagrams from memory to show exactly how the atmospheric processors on Mars Colony 7 were built, changed, and finally destroyed. He made detailed timelines and checked them against official maintenance logs that he could get to through public records. And slowly, with great care, a picture began to form. Marcus Torben started buying parts from a company called Helion Industrial 3 months before the disaster. The parts were 20 to 30% cheaper than the ones that were supposed to be the same but were made to lower standards. Torben had made up inspection reports that said the bad parts met the requirements. He then kept the difference between what the colony paid for parts and what he actually spent, more than 200,000 credits in 3 months. Kale's changes to the atmospheric processors should have made up for small differences in the quality of the parts. He made the system with a lot of extra safety room. But the Helion parts weren't just lower quality, they were fundamentally flawed, with structural weaknesses that shouldn't have been there in certified parts. The broken parts, along with the sabotaged code that turned off some monitoring systems, caused a catastrophic cascade failure. Before anyone could do anything, the processors got too hot, the emergency shutdown didn't work, and poisonous gases filled the living quarters in Section 7. 47 people, including kids, have died. Marcus Torbin just wanted more money. Cale felt the familiar rage building up in his chest, but he used it to focus. Anger wouldn't help. Proof would. The breakthrough came from a place no one expected. Cale's sister, Emma Vinson, had been looking into Mars Colony 7 on her own. She had contacted dozens of Cale's old co-workers, but most of them didn't want to talk to her. But she did find someone who would talk. Jennifer Rodriguez, a junior technician who had worked for Cale. Jennifer had seen the changes in parts. She even told Cale about them because she was worried about using parts that weren't specified in important systems. Cale had looked into it, found out about Torbin's plan, and told his boss about it. Jennifer didn't know what happened after that fight until recently. A friend of hers who worked in Colony 7's security department had said something strange. All of the surveillance footage from the maintenance bays in the week before the disaster had been deleted. It was officially blamed on a problem with the computer. But the security officer thought it was strange that only that one piece of footage had been affected. Jennifer gave her testimony, which was recorded in a formal deposition. She backed up Cale's claims about the part changes, confirmed that he had raised safety concerns, and said that he was very careful about keeping the system up to date. Jennifer said in her deposition, "Cale Vinson was the most careful engineer I ever worked with. He checked everything 3 times. If the processors broke while he was in charge, it was because someone did it on purpose. He would never have been careless." Administrator Reeves gave the reviewing board Jennifer's testimony, as well as the financial records that showed Torbin's shady business dealings and the technical analysis that showed the Helion parts were broken. The board decided to look into Cale's case again. The news that Port Meridian was reopening spread quickly through the small community. Most of the people who lived at the station were engineers, miners, and other technical experts. They all respected Cale's work on redemption and appreciated skilled craftsmanship. People's opinions started to change. More and more, Cale was the one who was favored in the station's common areas, forums, and social spaces. People who had first thought of him as just another escaped convict now saw him as a victim of corporate corruption, a skilled engineer who had been wronged by the system. Dr. Marcus Wu became an unofficial supporter and spoke out about Cale's technical skills and how unfair his conviction was. Wu told the station's news service, "This man built a spacecraft out of mining debris. He solved engineering problems that would be hard for professional teams with unlimited resources. And we should believe he was too dumb to keep the atmospheric processors running? The story doesn't fit with the facts." Facility Sigma 9 was under a lot of pressure to answer serious questions about their security measures. How was it possible for a prisoner to gather materials and build a spaceship without being caught? What other mistakes were made? Were prisoners being watched closely enough? An independent safety review was ordered, and inspectors found many problems at Sigma 9, such as not enough guards, not enough surveillance in remote tunnels, and maintenance procedures that hadn't been updated in years. The warden of the facility was put on leave until the investigation was over. A few guards were punished. People looked closely at the whole operation. Cale watched these events unfold from his room, feeling both happy and cautious. Every new piece of information helped his case, but he knew he couldn't rely on anything until a court officially cleared him. At the same time, Vera's situation was getting better. Emma, her daughter, had shown herself to be a very determined investigator. Using her skills as a data analyst, she had followed the money between Vera's former business partner, Christine Holloway, and a number of other companies that were competing with them. It was clear that Holloway had been selling private client information for years, making millions of dollars in illegal profits. She had been careful and used shell companies and cryptocurrency to hide the money. But Emma figured out how they were connected. Emma also found messages between Holloway and her lawyer that strongly suggested they had made up evidence against Vera. This was even worse. The messages were heavily encrypted, but Emma had found a weakness in the encryption protocol and used it to her advantage. This was against the law, but the content was very sensitive. Administrator Reeves told Emma that they couldn't use evidence that was gotten illegally in court. "But we can use it to help with the legal investigation. We can find evidence that is allowed in court and proves the same things if we know where to look." The judge agreed to the request and forensic accountants got to work. In just a few weeks, they found what Emma had already found. Proof that Holloway was selling data, proof that he was laundering money, and messages that showed how she framed Vera. They took Holloway into custody. She agreed to a plea deal that included testifying about framing Vera in exchange for a shorter sentence when the evidence against her was too strong. Vera's conviction was thrown out. When Administrator Reeves told Vera the news, she started to cry. A judge's decision took away 12 years of her life, 12 years of being separated from her daughter, and 12 years of being called a criminal. Reeves said softly, "You can go now, Miss Santos. Your record will be cleared, you'll get money for being wrongfully imprisoned, and everyone involved will apologize in writing." Vera looked up through her tears. What about Cale? His case is still being looked at. But the momentum is on his side. 2 days later, Cale's sister Emma came to see him. She had come to Port Meridian to help him. Cale hugged his little sister, who is now a grown woman, for a long time as if she might disappear. "I'm so sorry," Emma said. "I should have trusted you from the start and fought harder." "You were only 20 when I was found guilty," Cale said. "You did all you could. And now you've helped me." Emma stepped back looking serious. "You need to know something. Torben learned about the investigation. He has hired lawyers and they are not cheap. They say the evidence is circumstantial, that money transfers don't prove sabotage, and that you're a desperate felon making wild claims." Cale felt the same frustration rising. Of course he's fighting. He has nothing to gain. "But we have something too," Emma said. "The surveillance footage I told you about that was deleted? The security guard who told Jennifer about it kept a copy. Not allowed, but he was suspicious enough about the deletion that he saved a copy." "What's on it?" "Torben in the maintenance bay, getting to your terminal 3 days before the disaster. He works on something there by himself for 40 minutes. The video doesn't show exactly what he did, but when you look at the changes made to the code in the system, the timeline lines up perfectly." Cale's heart was racing. "That's proof right there. Proof that he got into my systems without permission. The security officer is ready to testify. He's retired now, so he has nothing to lose. And he's mad that 47 people died because he didn't say anything sooner." Things were starting to make sense. Jennifer Rodriguez's testimony about the changes to the parts. Records of Torben's fraud in the form of money. Surveillance video showing someone getting into Cale's systems without permission. Technical analysis showing that the Helion parts were broken. It wasn't a perfect case. Good lawyers could still make people doubt it, but it was strong. Much stronger than Cale's first defense. Based on new evidence, Administrator Reeves filed a formal request for a new trial. Because the claims of wrongful conviction were so serious and the case had gotten so much public attention, the petition was granted. The retrial would happen on Mars Colony 7, where the crime happened. Cale would have to go back to the place where everything went wrong in his life. Cale was in his room looking out at the stars through the viewport when he got the news about the retrial date. Port Meridian orbited a small moon. From this angle he could see the gas giant that the moon circled, its clouds swirling and glowing in the distance. Vera came to see Cale. She was now free, but she chose to stay at Port Meridian to help him. She asked, "How are you?" Cale said, "I'm scared. What if we don't win? What if Torben's lawyers are smart enough to make the evidence look bad? I might have to go back to Sigma 9 for another 19 years. "You could," Vera said. "But that's not going to happen. Do you know why? Because you're not the same person who was found guilty the first time. At the time, you were a naive engineer who thought that the truth would set you free. Now you know how the system works. You made a Starship out of trash, broke out of a prison that no one could escape from, and lived through an 8-month trip through space. Someone who can do all of that, they can win in court." Cale was able to smile. "When did you start to feel so good?" "When my daughter found proof against one of the most careful criminals I've ever met and got my conviction thrown out. You can beat Torben if Emma can do that." They stood together looking at the stars. They had both been through hell and come out stronger. The new trial was set to happen in 3 months. 3 months to get ready, gather evidence, and get ready for the biggest fight of his life. Cale had gotten out of a real prison. Now he had to get out of the legal one. This time he had friends, proof, and the truth on his side. Once again the impossible was becoming possible. Mars Colony 7 looked just like Cale remembered it. A huge group of domes connected to each other on the rusty red surface of the first settlement on another planet. From space it looked calm, well-organized, and a great example of engineering and human will. Cale knew better than that. 47 people died in those domes, gasping for air, because one man's greed was more important than their safety. The transport shuttle went down toward the main spaceport of the colony. Cale was still technically a prisoner because he was in restraints. 2 Port Meridian security officers were with him. Vera sat across the aisle, even though she didn't have to go because she was legally required to. "You came for me when no one else would," she said simply. "I'm not leaving you now." There were also Emma, Dr. Marcus Wu, who had agreed to be an expert witness, and Administrator Helen Reeves, who was there to make sure everyone was treated fairly. Marcus Chin, Cale's defense lawyer, was a smart, young lawyer who worked on cases of wrongful conviction. He was not related to Cale's former cellmate. The shuttle touched down. Cale saw the welcome committee as they got off the ship. There were colony security, court officers, and in the back Marcus Torbin himself, watching with cold eyes. Torbin had gotten older in the past year. His hair was grayer and his face was more lined. But he still acted like he was better than everyone else. He wore a very expensive suit, which was way too much for a colony operations chief to afford on his salary alone. He was also surrounded by 3 lawyers who looked just as expensive. Their eyes met from across the landing bay. Torbin looked down on him and didn't care. He was sure that Cale had no chance. Cale looked back steadily and his eyes sent a clear message. I know what you did. And I'm going to show you. The new trial was set to start in 3 days. Those 3 days were a crazy time of getting ready. Chen worked 16 hours a day, getting witnesses ready, organizing evidence, and practicing what they would say in court. Emma worked with the prosecution, yes, the prosecution, because they had new evidence that made them think about charging Torbin with negligent homicide and fraud. The law was strange. In a technical sense, Cale's retrial had nothing to do with the charges against Torbin. But in practice they were linked. If the court found proof of sabotage, Cale would probably be cleared and Torbin would be charged. If not, Cale would go back to jail and Torbin would be free. The next few days would be very important. There were a lot of people in the courtroom on the first day of the retrial. The case got a lot of attention from the public because of the escaped convict who built a starship, the claims of corporate corruption, and the deaths of 47 innocent people. Representatives from media outlets on Mars and in Earth's orbit had come. A strict woman in her 60s named Patricia Okonkwo was the judge. She was known for being fair and not taking any nonsense. She had read through the case files a lot and made it clear that she would not accept any games from either side. She said at the beginning, "This court will find out the truth. Not what's easy, not what's politically smart, but what really happened. Both sides will show proof, witnesses will testify, and we will follow that proof wherever it leads." The prosecution went first and laid out their case against Cale. The failure of the atmospheric processor, the 47 deaths, and the technical evidence that Cale's changes had made the disaster worse. It was bad testimony just like it had been at the first trial. Logs from the systems showed that Cale's access codes had been used to change the way the processors worked. His signature was on the maintenance records. He had been in charge of the broken equipment. But this time the defense was ready. Chen's cross-examination was very precise. He asked the systems expert if access codes were safe. Chen asked, "Can someone use someone else's access code without them knowing?" "Yes, in theory if they got the code." "And how would they get it?" "They would have to steal it or get the code from someone." Chen suggested, "Or they could watch the person enter the code and remember it, right? Or they could use video footage to see the code being entered." The expert said this could happen. Chen went to the records for maintenance. "Are these signatures that are supposed to show that Mr. Vincent approved the bad parts digital or physical?" "Digital. Digital signatures are linked to login information, right? The same information that could be stolen or hacked, right?" "That's right." The prosecution's case was based on the idea that only Cale could have made the changes, but that idea started to fall apart. The defense showed its evidence on the second day. Jennifer Rodriguez talked about the part changes and how she had told Cale about her worries and he had looked into them. Her testimony was clear, thorough, and convincing. Next, the financial expert took the stand and explained to the jury what Torbin did with Helion Industrial. The numbers were clear. There were more than 200,000 credits paid for parts, but only 150,000 were actually spent. The difference showed up in accounts connected to shell companies that Torbin owned. Chen asked, "Do these financial records show fraud in your expert opinion?" "Yes. There is clear and organized fraud going on, with the replacement of low-quality parts and personal gain." Sarah Blackwell, Torbin's main lawyer, tried to discredit the testimony. She was a well-spoken woman. "Isn't it possible," she asked, "that my client was just looking for cheaper options that still met the requirements?" "The parts didn't meet the requirements," the expert said. "Tests have shown that they had structural problems that led to the processor failing. Testing done recently years after the disaster. Can we really trust the results from parts that have been damaged? The patterns of degradation themselves are proof. These parts broke in ways that properly made parts would not." On the third day, Dr. Wu talked about Cale's technical skills and went into great detail about the engineering genius that went into building Redemption. Mr. Vinson solved problems that would be hard for professional teams, Wu said. His knowledge of integrated systems, thermal dynamics, and structural engineering is amazing. It doesn't make sense that someone like him would carelessly maintain atmospheric processors. Blackwell's cross-examination was mostly about the difference between following standard procedures and doing creative emergency engineering. Isn't it possible, Doctor, that Mr. Vinson was good at thinking on his feet but not very good at following safety rules? Wu kept his eyes on her. I looked over the maintenance logs from before the disaster. Mr. Vinson's work was very thorough. He followed all the rules and did all the checks on time. He wasn't careless, he was a model employee. Day 4 brought the testimony that really changed the course of the trial. The security officer who had saved the video footage. Robert Chin, a retired security officer from Mars Colony 7 who was not related to the lawyer, was in his late 60s and looked like someone who had been through a lot of tough times. He talked about how the footage was deleted. I'd worked in security for 30 years and I'd never seen surveillance data just disappear like that. It made me suspicious, so I kept a backup copy on my personal drive. Was that allowed? The prosecutor asked. No. It went against the rules. But I had a gut feeling that something was wrong. The video was shown in court. The timestamp said it was 3 days before the disaster. The camera angle showed the maintenance bay, which was where the main control terminal for the atmospheric processors was. Marcus Torbin came into the bay at 22:47. He carefully looked around to see if anyone was watching before going to the terminal. He logged in and the video showed him entering a code. A computer analysis showed that he had used Cale's access credentials. Torbin worked at the terminal for the next 42 minutes. The video didn't show the screen, but it did show him typing, checking data tablets and looking nervous from time to time. At 23:29 he logged out, wiped the terminal surface with a cloth, presumably to get rid of fingerprints, and left. The processor stopped working 3 days later. When the video ended, the courtroom was quiet. Everyone looked at Torbin, whose face had turned white. Blackwell tried to fix the problem. This video shows my client getting to a terminal, but it doesn't show what he was doing. Maybe he was doing a routine check. Using someone else's access credentials? Chin cut in. Cleaning the terminal after doing an inspection in the middle of the night? That's what someone would do during a routine inspection. The security officer's story went on. I looked over the system logs from that night. Someone with Cale Vinson's access code changed the monitoring subroutines for the atmospheric processors. These changes turned off some safety alerts and changed the temperature control settings. Chin asked, the same changes that led to the terrible failure? Yes. The prosecution called its last witness on the 5th day, Cale himself. He got up on the stand with his heart racing. This was it, his chance to tell his story directly, to look the jury in the eyes and make them understand. Chin carefully guided him through his testimony. Cale talked about his job at Colony 7, how proud he was of the atmospheric processors, and how he found the part substitutions. He talked about how he had to face Torbin, the threats he had gotten, and the evidence that had gone missing. Cale said clearly, I didn't mess with those systems. I made them safe to protect people. When I found out that Torbin was using bad parts, I tried to stop it. I tried to do the right thing, and for that, I was accused of 47 murders. His voice cracked a little. Marcus Torbin cared more about money than people's lives. He let me take the blame to save himself. Blackwell's questioning was harsh. She tried to make Cale look like a bitter ex-convict who was making desperate claims. Mr. Vinson, isn't it true that you got away from prison? Yes. You made an illegal spaceship and ran away from the law? I built a spaceship to get away from a false conviction. There's nothing wrong with trying to prove you're innocent. You broke a lot of laws along the way. I broke unfair rules that were put in place because of a false conviction. I won't say I'm sorry for that. Blackwell changed his mind. You say the evidence against you was made up. But isn't it more likely that you, faced with overwhelming proof of your guilt, convinced yourself of an elaborate conspiracy to protect your ego? Cale looked her in the eye without blinking. I'm an engineer, so I deal with proof, evidence, and facts that can be shown. The facts show that Torbin committed fraud, got into my systems without permission, and made changes that caused a disaster. Those aren't conspiracy theories, they're facts that have been documented. The cross-examination went on for hours, but Cale didn't give in. He had lived for a year in an asteroid mine and made a spaceship out of trash. Even the most aggressive questions from a lawyer couldn't break him. The defense stopped on day 6. Both sides gave their final arguments. Blackwell argued for Cale's guilt. The original conviction was sound. What we've seen this week is a sophisticated attempt to shift blame, using financial irregularities and stolen surveillance footage to create reasonable doubt. But the core facts remain: Cale Vinson's access codes, Cale Vinson's signatures, Cale Vinson's modifications. The evidence points to him. Chen's closing was full of emotion. Marcus Torbin stole Mr. Vinson's access codes, forged digital signatures, made changes, and then erased evidence of his crimes. He killed 47 people out of greed and negligence, and then he ruined an innocent man's life to cover it up. The surveillance footage shows that Torbin accessed Mr. Vinson's systems. The financial records show that he was lying. The expert testimony shows that the faulty parts he bought caused the disaster. Cale Vinson is innocent. It's time to make this terrible wrong right. The jury took 2 days to make their decision. Cale hardly slept for 2 days, pacing around his temporary quarters and going over every piece of evidence and every moment of the trial. Vera stayed with him and kept him calm when his anxiety threatened to take over. "Whatever happens," she told him, "you've already won in the ways that matter. You showed the world your strength, your creativity, and your refusal to give up. No one can take that away from you." The jury said they had reached a decision on the second day in the afternoon. The court came back together. Cale stood up with Chen and Emma on either side of him as the jury foreman did the same. The foreman read, "In the case of the Mars Colony 7 atmospheric disaster, we find the defendant, Cale Vinson, not guilty of all charges." The words echoed in the courtroom. Not guilty. Not guilty. Cale's legs almost gave out. Emma caught him, and then she hugged him and he cried too, feeling waves of relief wash over him. Judge Okonkwo said something. "Mr. Vinson, based on the evidence presented in this trial, this court finds that you were wrongfully convicted. Your record will be expunged, you will receive full compensation for time wrongfully imprisoned, and formal apologies will be issued by all relevant parties." She looked over at Marcus Torbin, whose face was pale. "Mr. Torbin, this court is issuing a warrant for your arrest on charges of fraud, negligent homicide, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. Bailiffs, please take him into custody." Security guards walked over to Torbin. For a second it looked like he might run away. Then, when the police put handcuffs on his wrists, his shoulders drooped in defeat. Torbin looked at him with pure hatred as they led him past Cale. "You couldn't just let it go," he said in a hiss. "You had to kill me." Cale looked at him with calm eyes. "I didn't hurt you, you hurt yourself. I just made sure the truth came out." Torbin was taken away and Cale turned to face the full courtroom. People were clapping. People who lived in the colony, reporters, and people who had been watching the trial. People were clapping for him. The late afternoon sun made long shadows on the Martian surface outside the courthouse. Cale stood with his sister Vera, Dr. Wu, and Administrator Reeves, breathing in the filtered air and feeling free for the first time in more than a year. Emma asked, "What now?" Cale looked up at the stars and saw Earth as a blue-green dot. "Now," he said, "we'll figure out what to do next. Together." The trial was done. Justice had been done. But Cale's story wasn't over yet. He built a starship out of rocks to show that the impossible could be done. He would now use the pieces of his broken old life to build a new one. He could do anything if he could survive an asteroid mine and turn despair into hope. The weeks after the trial felt like a dream. Cale had been fighting for so long, fighting to stay alive, fighting to get away, and fighting to prove his innocence, that he didn't know how to live without a threat hanging over him. At a public ceremony, the Mars Colonial Authority officially apologized for wrongfully convicting him. They offered a large sum of money, 3 million credits for the year of wrongful imprisonment, plus damages for ruining their careers and causing them emotional pain. Cale had never thought he would have that much money, but it felt empty because he would never get back the year of his life. Restoring his professional reputation was more important. The Mars Engineering Guild put out a formal statement saying that Cale Vinson had been falsely accused and that his engineering credentials were not only valid but also very good. Dr. Marcus Wu personally paid for Cale to get his full professional status back. But the best part was when the Mars Colonial Authority said they would change how they keep an eye on safety. The 47 people who died didn't die for nothing. Their deaths would now lead to stronger protections, better monitoring, and measures to hold people accountable that would stop corruption from happening again. In the middle dome of Colony 7, a memorial was built with the names of all 47 victims on it. Cale went to the dedication ceremony and stood quietly as each name was read out loud. Some of the families of the dead were there, some looking at him with suspicion, others with sympathy or even an apology. Later, a woman named Margaret Chin, whose husband David was one of the people who died, came up to him. She was in her 60s, had silver hair, and her eyes had seen too much sadness. She said softly, Mr. Vinson, I testified against you at your first trial. I told the court that you must have been careless and that someone had to be to blame for taking my David away from me. Cale remembered what she had said and how it had hurt him like knives. I'm sorry, Margaret said again, her voice full of feeling. I was wrong. I was mean because I was sad. You lost a year of your life because people like me needed someone to blame. That was not right. Cale's throat felt tight. You lost your husband. You needed answers and justice. I get that. Justice isn't getting back at someone who is innocent, Margaret said. I hope you can forgive me one day. They stood there for a moment without saying anything, two people who had lost loved ones and were now able to understand each other in a way they hadn't before. Cale finally said, I forgive you. And I promise you that David and the others won't be forgotten. From now on, the work I do will honor their memory. Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face, and left. That talk with Cale changed something in him. He had been focused on clearing his name and proving himself. But the memorial, the families, and Margaret's apology all reminded him that this was about more than just him. There were 47 dead. Their deaths meant something, and Cale had a chance to give that meaning a purpose that he made up his mind about what to do next. 2 months after the trial, Cale was in a small office in the industrial sector of Mars Colony 7. The space was small with only 3 rooms and basic equipment, but it was his. The door had a sign that said, Vinson Safety Systems, Independent Engineering Consultation and Safety Analysis. His first job was to check the air systems in all 12 colony domes for the Mars Colonial Authority itself. Everyone saw the irony. The man they had found guilty of destroying one system was now being paid to make sure all systems were safe. Cale worked with a lot of passion and energy. He looked over every processor, backup system, and safety rule. He found a lot of small problems and 3 big ones that could have caused big problems in the future. His reports were thorough, technical, and left no room for doubt. The colonial government followed all of his advice. Word got around quickly. Your systems were safe if Cale Vinson said they were. You fixed the problem right away if he found one because you trusted him completely. The engineer who built a Starship out of trash and lived through impossible odds wasn't going to let bad work go unnoticed or accept excuses. In just 6 months, Vinson Safety Systems had 12 employees and contracts on Mars and 3 orbital stations. They had 40 employees within a year and were being asked for advice on projects all over the inner solar system. People started to think of Cale as the engineer who won't compromise, instead of the wrongfully convicted engineer. Companies wanted him to be certified because it meant something. He took the duty of analyzing the systems very seriously because lives depended on them. But Cale didn't start the business by himself. Vera Santos was hired as the chief of operations because she was an expert in data analysis and system architecture. Her 12 years in prison for a crime she didn't commit gave her a unique view on how institutions fail and how important it is to be held accountable. She and Cale worked together to build a company culture based on strict rules and doing the right thing. At a company meeting, Vera said, "We both know what happens when people cut corners and put profit over safety. We're here to make sure it never happens again. Not while we're in charge." Emma Vinson took over as the lead investigator and used her analytical skills to look into how companies buy things, keep things up, and keep things safe. Emma found any corruption or carelessness that was hidden. She had found out that her brother had been wrongly convicted and that her mother's business partner had committed crimes. Corporate fraud didn't stand a chance against her. Dr. Marcus Wu was the company's senior technical advisor. His decades of experience and respected name helped the company with its work. His presence showed the industry that Vinson Safety Systems was a top-notch professional company. Robert Chin, a retired security guard who had saved the important surveillance footage, even joined the team as head of security and evidence preservation. He said, "For 30 years, I watched bad things happen because people didn't speak up. I'm making sure the evidence always speaks loud and clear." The team worked very hard because they had all experienced unfairness and wanted to make sure it didn't happen again. 1 year after the company started, they took on their hardest case, auditing Facility Sigma 9, the asteroid prison where Cale and Vera had been held. Since their escape, the facility had been in the news for all the wrong reasons. The safety review found a lot of violations, the warden was fired, and a few guards were charged with crimes for treating prisoners badly. But the facility was still open and still housed 200 prisoners. Cale stood at the airlock of Sigma 9, almost 2 years after he had escaped through a makeshift launch shaft. He felt a mix of anger, fear, triumph, and something else. Taking charge, Diana Foster, the current warden, met him in person. She is a strict but fair woman. "Mr. Vinson, I want you to know that this facility will fully cooperate with your audit. We'll do whatever you find and suggest. No longer will Sigma-9 be run like a forgotten hellhole. Kale spent 2 weeks on the asteroid checking out every system, tunnel, and piece of equipment. He went to the hole where he had built Redemption, which is now closed off and marked as a historical site. Some people at the facility thought his escape was legendary and a sign that human creativity could win out even in the worst situations, that he thought the mine systems were barely good enough. The life support system worked, but it was old. The emergency plans weren't good enough. There were places where monitoring systems couldn't see. The mining equipment wasn't taken care of properly. His report was harsh but helpful. He didn't just point out problems, he also gave detailed solutions, ranked them by how they would affect safety, and included cost estimates and timelines for putting them into action. His report said, Facility Sigma-9 is currently operating at minimal acceptable safety standards. However, minimal is not good enough when it comes to human lives, even the lives of convicted criminals. To make this facility safe and humane again, the following suggestions must be put into action. The report got a lot of attention from the media. Groups that fight for prisoners' rights used it to push for changes throughout the prison system. Politicians who had been ignoring the problem were suddenly forced to do something about it. Within 6 months, money was set aside to make major improvements to Sigma-9 and 3 other prisons. Kale's company was in charge of making sure the work was done correctly. Kale met Marcus Morrison, the prisoner who had shared a cell with him during his first few months at Sigma-9, while he was there to check on the upgrades. Marcus had been the quiet one who kept to himself and seemed to be broken by the system. But Marcus looked different now, healthier, more awake, and with a sense of purpose in his eyes. "Vincent," Marcus said as he walked up slowly, "I heard you were here. Heard about everything, including the trial, your business, and more. You really did it, man. You got out and won. How much longer do you have to serve?" Kale wanted to know. 3 years. But really? Things are better here now. Better food, better living conditions, and real safety rules. The guards treat us like people, not animals. I heard that's because of what you said. Kale said, everyone deserves safe conditions. Whether you're guilty or not, you're still a person. Marcus nodded slowly. I'd like to work for you when I get out if you're still hiring. Before I came here, I worked as a maintenance technician. I know how to work with systems, and I want to do something that matters. He got a business card from Kale. Get in touch with me 6 months before your release. We will talk about chances. Kale couldn't forget about the meeting. He had to run away to save himself, but his escape and fight made things better for hundreds of other prisoners. His refusal to accept unfairness had effects that went far beyond his own case. Kale stuck to some of his principles as Vincent's safety systems grew. The business would never put safety at risk for the sake of making money. They would never hide problems to keep a client safe. And 10% of their contracts would be free work for small colonies, underfunded facilities, or advocacy groups that couldn't pay for their services. Kale told his team, the big contracts bring in enough money. We can help people who can't pay. That's not being nice, it's being responsible. Kale got an unexpected message 2 years after he was cleared. It was from Jennifer Rodriguez, the junior technician who had spoken up for him. Kale, I hope this message finds you well. Again, I want to thank you for clearing your name and exposing Torbin. I also wanted to let you know that your example moved me. I'm back in school to study engineering with a focus on safety systems. I'd like to work for a company like yours someday, one that puts people ahead of making money. I'm working on Colony 8's life support systems until then, and I'm doing it right just like you taught me. Thanks for showing me what honesty looks like. Kale read the message 3 times. He felt a warm feeling in his chest that had nothing to do with winning and everything to do with legacy. He had been Jennifer's mentor years ago, and now she was living out the values he had tried to teach her. Kale stood in his office one night and looked at the wall of awards, certifications, and framed news stories. The headline that cleared him was Wrongfully Convicted Engineer Cleared After Dramatic Trial. There was an award for engineering excellence in the industry. He got the humanitarian award for his work for free. But the thing he cared about the most was a small, framed picture of Redemption, his impossible starship. It is now on display in Port Meridian's Engineering Museum as an example of human creativity and determination. Vera came in with 2 cups of coffee. Thinking back. Reflecting, Kale said, taking the coffee. I was in a cell on an asteroid 3 years ago, sure that my life was over. Look at this now, Vera said simply, you built it. Just like you made Redemption. You saw what needed to be there and made it happen. Kale said, we made it. I couldn't have done any of this by myself. They stood in comfortable silence, Two people who had made something meaningful out of the mess of their lives. A new message came in on Kale's terminal. It was from Emma Santos, Vera's daughter. She was looking into a possible safety violation at a factory on Titan. Mom, Kale, found something big. The company has been lying about the results of pressure vessel inspections. Some of these units are already on colony ships. We need to move quickly before someone dies. Sending the whole data packet now. Kale and Vera looked at each other. There it was again, another fight, another challenge, and another chance to stop something bad from happening. Kale said, "Let's get to work," and he was already heading to his terminal. The work never stopped. There would always be another safety violation, another company putting profit before lives, and another corner being cut. But that was fine. Kale had found his purpose: to stand between negligence and disaster and make sure that the 47 people who died on his watch were the last victims of corporate greed that he could have stopped. That he was going to be sent to an asteroid mine and told to dig until he died. Instead, he dug his way out and made something much more useful than a starship. That he left behind a legacy of safety, honesty, and high standards. He had turned a personal tragedy into something good for everyone. What seemed impossible had become possible. And Kale Vinson was just getting started. 5 years after he was found not guilty, Kale stood on the observation deck of Meridian Station. This was the same Port Meridian where he and Vera had first arrived in Redemption. The station had since grown in importance as a hub for trade between the outer systems and had been renamed to reflect this. The view was amazing. The station was in orbit around a gas giant with rings. From this angle, the rings caught the light of the distant sun and looked like a halo around the huge planet. There were cargo ships, passenger liners, mining ships, and scientific ships all moving through the space around the station. Redemption was one of them, and it was kept in a special docking bay that could be seen through the observation window. The small, rough starship had been fixed up and kept as a permanent exhibit to show what determination and creativity could do when the odds were against them. Kale came here a lot when he needed to clear his head. He had a lot on his mind today. Vincent's safety systems had grown into something he never thought possible. They now had more than 200 employees working in 12 places in the solar system. For some kinds of installations, the law required them to have certifications. The safety rules they used had become standards in the industry. Lives had been saved. There were specific, documented cases where their audits had found major problems before disasters happened. But with success came new problems. They were trying to sell to bigger companies for huge amounts of money. Politicians wanted to use the company's good name to further their own goals. Competitors spread false information to try to hurt their credibility. Kale had to choose between keeping the company small and independent, which would give them complete control over their standards, or accepting investment and growth, which could help more people but also risk weakening their values. "Thought I'd find you here," a voice said behind him. Kale turned to see Vera coming. Her hair was grayer now, but her eyes were still as sharp as ever. Over the years, she had become more than just a business partner. She was his best friend and the person who knew him better than anyone else. Vera told him, "The board meeting is in an hour. Have you made up your mind about what to say to them?" The board wanted to take a big investment offer from Stellar Dynamics, a huge company that does business all over the solar system. The money would let Vincent Safety Systems grow to every major colony, check systems that weren't being checked, and save even more lives. But Stellar Dynamics would want seats on the board, the power to make decisions for the company, and eventually a controlling interest. They were offering money and power in exchange for freedom. Kale said, "I keep thinking about why we started this business. We had both been hurt by systems that put profit ahead of people. We wanted to make something different, something that couldn't be broken or corrupted." Vera said, "And we did. But Kale, we're turning down contracts because we can't handle them all. There are small colonies, mining stations, and orbital platforms that need our help, but we can't get to them. If we accept the investment, we could help them. We'll lose control if we take the money. Sooner or later, someone at Stellar Dynamics will ask us to ignore a violation, certify something that isn't quite safe, or put their interests ahead of actual safety." Vera let out a sigh. "You might be right, but what's the other option? Stay small and watch people die because we couldn't grow fast enough to check their systems?" It was the same old problem: principles versus pragmatism, purity versus impact. Kale looked out the window at Redemption. He built that ship with no help, no resources, and only his will and creativity. He had to solve problems that seemed impossible because there was no other way. Kale suddenly said, "We find a third option. We don't take their money, but we don't stay small. We teach other people." "What do you mean?" "We can't check every facility in the solar system ourselves, but we can teach other engineers how we do things, what our standards are, and how we don't compromise. We set up a certification program called Vinson Safety Certified Engineers. We train them hard, hold them to our standards, and give them permission to do audits under our name. Vera's eyes got bigger. Franchise the method, not the business. That's right. We have full control over the standards and certification process. If an engineer doesn't meet our standards, they lose their license. But we use their time and knowledge to get to facilities that we can't audit ourselves. It might work, Vera said slowly, thinking about what that would mean. We'd have to make full training programs, set up testing procedures, and set up ways to keep an eye on things. Cale agreed, it's a huge job. But so was making a Starship out of trash. We've done things that seemed impossible before. Vera smiled. When do we begin? There was a lot of disagreement at the board meeting. Some members were counting on the Stellar Dynamics investment and were let down by Cale's plan. But other people saw the genius in it, a way to make a bigger difference without giving up your values. The board voted after 3 hours of discussion. They barely approved Cale's plan to start the Vinson Safety Certified Engineer program instead of taking money from outside sources. Cale felt a wave of relief wash over him. They had picked the harder but right path. It took 2 years to make the training program. Cale and Vera worked with Dr. Marcus Wu and other experts to make a full curriculum that included not only technical skills but also how to make moral choices, how to resist outside pressure, and how to put safety ahead of profit. The first group of candidates was made up of 30 experienced engineers from all over the solar system who had applied for the tough program. They trained hard for 6 months, learning not only how to spot safety violations but also how to stand up to companies that would try to get them to ignore problems. The last test was very hard. Candidates had to check out a fake facility with violations that were both obvious and not so obvious, deal with actors playing corporate executives who were offering bribes and threats, and write detailed reports on time. Only 17 of the 30 candidates passed. Some of the people who failed were heartbroken and begged for another chance. Cale talked to them directly. I know you're upset. I know you worked hard. But this isn't about effort, it's about lives. If you certified a system as safe when it wasn't, people would die. That's not okay. You can take the test again in 6 months if you're willing to do the extra training. But I will never lower the standards. The 17 who passed became the first Vinson Safety Certified Engineers, which meant they could do audits and certifications under the company's name. They spread across the solar system, bringing strict safety rules to places that had never had such close supervision before. The certified engineers found and fixed more than 50 serious safety problems at different sites in less than a year. Their work stopped 3 possible disasters from happening. The program grew. There were more applicants and more engineers were trained and certified. Some people failed, but those who passed became evangelists for the standards that Cale had set. Vinson Safety Systems stayed small, independent, and completely uncompromising. But their power grew as certified engineers spread their methods throughout human history. 7 years after he was found not guilty, Cale got a message on a quiet night that made his hands shake. Marcus Torbin sent it. Torbin had been found guilty of evidence tampering, negligent homicide, and fraud. He had been given a 25-year sentence at a maximum security prison on Luna. Cale hadn't thought about him in years and had purposely stayed away from news about his imprisonment. The message was clear. Cale, I know I have no right to contact you. I know I destroyed your life and killed 47 people through my greed and cowardice. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I've spent every day of the past 7 years thinking about what I did. I've read every article about your company, about the lives you've saved, about the standards you've established. You took the worst thing I did to you and turned it into something that helps people. That's not redemption for me, I'll never be redeemed. But it's hope that maybe, somehow, some good came from all that tragedy. I'm sorry. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. Cale read the message 3 times. He thought, nothing. No anger, no pleasure in Torbin's pain, and no desire for revenge. It was like Torbin was a character from someone else's story, and I felt very far away from him. He thought about answering, but what would he say? What words could possibly matter after all that had happened? He saved the message but didn't reply in the end. Torbin had to deal with his own guilt and regret. Cale had other things that were more important to him. 10 years after building Redemption, Cale stood in front of 500 people in the main assembly hall of Mars Colony 7. He was asked to give the keynote speech at the Solar System Engineering Conference, which is the most important meeting of engineers in human history. The speech was being shown on TV in all the major colonies and stations. A lot of people would watch. Cale looked out at the crowd, which included experienced engineers, young students, business people, and government officials. He recognized some of them like Vera, Emma, Dr. Wu, Jennifer Rodriguez, who is now a successful safety engineer, and dozens of Vincent safety-certified engineers. He started. 10 years ago, I stood in a different kind of hall, a courtroom, where I was found guilty of killing 47 people through negligence. I was sent to an asteroid mine, where I was supposed to dig in the dark until I died. Many of you know what happened next. I built a starship out of trash and escaped. I fought to prove my innocence and won. But that's not the story I want to tell you today. The story I want to tell is about what happens when the impossible becomes possible. What do you do when you've overcome the impossible and are faced with an even bigger question? What now? When I was cleared of all charges, I could have left. I could have taken the money from the settlement, moved to a quiet colony and lived a quiet life. No one would have thought badly of me. I had worked hard for that peace. But I couldn't do it. Because 47 people were still dead. Because their deaths only had meaning if I gave them meaning. Because the same corruption, the same willingness to cut corners, and the same prioritization of profit over safety were still present in all of our societies. So I took a different path. I decided to fight. Not against asteroids or false convictions this time, but against the systemic neglect that kills people every day in ways that never make the news. In the last 10 years, Vincent Safety Systems and our certified engineers have inspected more than 3,000 buildings. We have found and fixed thousands of safety violations. We have proof that our work has stopped at least 12 catastrophic disasters that would have killed hundreds of people. But the most important thing is that we've changed the culture. Businesses know that they will be found out if they cut corners. Engineers know that they won't get in trouble for sticking to safety rules. Facilities know that getting a Vincent certification means something. This didn't happen because I'm special. It happened because I refused to believe that injustice and carelessness were unavoidable. It happened because I used the skills I learned while building a starship out of rocks to build something even more valuable. Systems that save lives. You all have the same ability. You can think of ways to fix a system that isn't working. You can resist pressure to give in. You can turn a bad situation into something good. The impossible becomes possible when we refuse to accept the world as it is and instead build the world as it should be. One decision at a time. One system at a time. One life saved at a time. I was sent to work in an asteroid mine. I made a starship out of rocks. But the ship isn't my biggest achievement, it's what I made after it. A history of safety. A culture that doesn't accept anything less than the best. A future where fewer people die in disasters that could have been avoided. That's the goal I'm still working toward. I hope you'll all join me. The applause was deafening. Cale stood at the podium and watched 500 engineers stand up. He felt a deep sense of completion. He had been broken and put back together. He had been wrongly convicted and then freed. He had lost a year of his life, but he had found a purpose that would last the rest of it. After the speech, a lot of people came up to shake his hand and ask questions. Cale saw a young woman waiting patiently at the edge of the crowd. She looked to be in her early 20s and she had bright, smart eyes and a lot of nervous energy. She walked over when the crowd got smaller. Mr. Vincent? I'm Sarah Chin, a junior engineer on Titan Station. I wanted to thank you for your work. Last year, one of your certified engineers audited our facility and found a serious problem with our methane processing system. If it hadn't been caught. Sarah's voice shook. 300 people live on that station and my family is one of them. Your engineers saved their lives. Cale's throat felt tight. What's the name of your engineer? Jennifer Rodriguez. Cale smiled. It was, of course, Jennifer, the junior technician he had taught years ago, was now saving lives herself. I'm applying for your certification program, Sarah said next. I want to be like you and Jennifer. I want to make systems safer and keep people safe. Cale said, the program is hard. The standards are strict. A lot of candidates don't make it. I know, Sarah said firmly but quietly. But I have to try. You showed us what could happen and now I want to help make it happen. Cale understood that this was the real test of his success when Sarah walked away. Not the company, the certifications, or the lives saved, even though all of those were important. The real success was getting the next generation to continue the work, to build on what he had started, and to keep pushing toward that horizon of perfect safety that could never be reached but must always be sought. Cale went back to Meridian Station that night. He stood on the observation deck again, this time looking through the window at Redemption. The rough little starship had taken him from hopelessness to freedom. It had shown that what seemed impossible was possible. But it was only the start. The real journey was everything that happened after that, starting a business, setting standards, training engineers, and making systems that saved lives. That trip wasn't over yet. It would never end. There would always be more lives to protect, more systems to check, and more work to do. Cale was ready for it though. He had been made in the fires of an asteroid mine, hardened by the cold of deep space, and polished by years of fighting for safety and justice. He was no longer the naive engineer who thought the truth would always win. He wasn't the desperate prisoner digging in the dark anymore. He wasn't even the defiant escapee who made a starship out of trash anymore. He was Cale Vinson, the man who started Vinson Safety Systems and set strict standards to protect lives. He also built a future where safety was more important than making money. They had sent him to an asteroid mine, where they thought he would die and be forgotten. He built a starship out of rocks, broke out of the impossible prison, cleared his name, and left a legacy that would save thousands of lives for generations to come. The horizon in front of him was endless and full of potential. And Cale Vinson was just getting started.